Hi everyone, this is Marianne and welcome to my newly renamed channel, The Unplanned Life. My channel used to bear my name, Marianne Mall, but because of some recent major life changes, I thought I'd also make some changes to the kind of content that I will share here, so I renamed my channel. I'm not yet sure what I will do actually, but I guess I'm just gonna wing it, and that is what The Unplanned Life is all about. Now in my previous video, I talked about the anti-planner and this is it now on the screen that you are seeing. I will link the video below in the description box. I suggest that you watch it because there were a couple of comments there saying that this is basically a bullet journal, but I also explained in my replies that it is not a bullet journal because it does not have the basic elements that makes a bullet journal a bullet journal. I don't have an index, for instance, and I don't have the symbols and the legends for the symbols. And for me, it's always just check marks and X marks, which is basic in any list since the beginning of lists. And I also don't have the monthly pages and the facing pages where you list down the things that you have to do for the month. And I don't have the dated sections because the anti-planner is not planner based. That's why I called it the anti-planner. And as I use this anti-planner more and more, I realize that it is energy based. I do things listed on here when I have the energy for it. When I don't have the energy for it, I just leave it be for the moment and stop obsessing about it. It has helped lower my stress levels so much, and I know that nothing will fall through the cracks because everything is listed. I won't forget about them, but I do them only when I have the energy for them. It makes sense to me at this point in my life to do things in this manner. And by the way, what you're hearing out there is a helicopter. I don't know what it's doing. Maybe it's doing some monitoring during the lockdown for the COVID-19 pandemic. But anyway, moving on. Right now, this moleskin notebook is almost completely filled up, and I did order a Taroko Mystique from Etsy before the COVID-19 lockdown, but right now it's still somewhere out there. Taiwan's post office is functional, and my notebook has left Taiwan promptly about 2 or 3 days after I ordered it. But our post office here in the Philippines has suspended operations indefinitely, so now I am out of a notebook. I do have other notebooks. I still have the Midori MD A5 notebook, but it's too thin for what I wanted to do. I wanted a 2-inch thick notebook, and I'll explain why later. And I also have the Covadis Habana Smooth, but because the paper is made especially for fountain pens, I didn't want to waste it because I just want to use a pencil, and using a pencil on paper that is specially made for fountain pens is a waste. So what I did was I went through my paper stash and found these old packs of A4 sized plain cream colored paper from the National Bookstore Paper Bar. I remember this was in SM Mega Mall. These are leftover paper from when I made a doodle planner for Julia, and I will link my video about Julia's doodle planner below in case you're interested. I also have a bunch of Elias A4 paper, but since I plan to use a pencil through and through for the anti-planner, I went with the paper bar packs because, I don't want to waste fountain pen paper by using non-fountain pens with them. I used my Fiskars rotary paper trimmer to measure and score each sheet of the A4 paper. Now I have a review of this paper trimmer too, and I will link it below in the description box. And I've already marked the 148 millimeter on the ruler because that's half of the A4 size, and that makes it A5. One thing I have noticed doing this step is that the A4 sheets are not exactly A4. It's not exactly A4. So after scoring with the edge of an aluminum ruler, the foredge of the folded sheets are not flush against each other, but I'll show you later how I fixed that. I made signatures, and each signature consisted of 4 sheets of paper, which was thin enough not to have too much paper creep, but thick enough to be rigid when stitching them and then gluing them together with other signatures. By the way, this paper from the paper bar is 100 GSM. It's really, really too thick for my purposes. I'd be happy enough with 80 GSM, but this is what I have, so I just made do with it. And after all that scoring and folding, I have all of these signatures. I was able to make about 27 signatures in all, I think, because didn't really count, which converts to exactly 108 sheets or 216 pages, and the thickness is just about 2 inches or a little less than 2 inches, which is really one of my major goals, and I'll show you later why. Now comes the next part, which is poking holes into the folds of the signatures. They all have to be lined up perfectly, or as near perfect as I possibly can, because I'm doing this by hand and I have I don't have the actual proper tools. But I made a template out of a sheet of A5 paper, marking where the thread would go into the fold and out of the fold so that the stray ends of the thread would all be hanging outside of the fold because I need those extra threads later. By the way, while I was midway into this project, I decided to get some fizzy vitamin drink in my steel tumbler with a reusable straw. This is Berocca. It comes in large tablets that dissolve in water. It has 500 milligrams of vitamin C and also some other vitamins like folic acid, zinc, magnesium, vitamin B complex, and biotin. And I just always put 2 tablets on there. And now comes the next part, which is poking holes into the folds of the signatures. For poking holes into the signatures, I started with an ordinary push pin, but it was too dull. So I used a large safety pin instead. I just stretched it out, and I had to be very careful to create only the holes that are needed. And because if you create too many holes too close to each other because of mistakes, the paper could tear those holes during the stitching process. Now take note that this was quite a difficult step for me because my right hand is no longer functioning 100%, and I have to confess that my right hand actually hurt for about 3 days after I finished creating this notebook. But as you will see later, it's so very much worth it. The ends that we go to just to have a notebook, I'm sure notebook and paper lovers would understand the sacrifice. Now, the most difficult part in my experience is the actual stitching of each signature for the same reasons, broken right hand, and also because I don't have the proper needle and thread for the task. I just used this ordinary needle that's made for fabrics, and this, see here, I'm holding it against a black background so you can see it better. And then this white thread that is also made for fabrics and just a little bit dirty. I think it's a very, very old spool. But then again, this is a lockdown, so I have no choice. I have to make do with what I have already in the house because I really do need this notebook. It was the usual in and out and in and out. The thread is knotted at the point where they enter and exit the paper, and like I said, the ends of the thread were left hanging in preparation for the next step, which is stitching all of the signatures together. But before that, remember we had a problem to fix. The A4 paper was not exactly A4 sized, so the foredge of the folded signatures were not flush against each other. What I did was I went back to my paper trimmer and trimmed the foredge of each signature so that the width of each would be back to the 148 millimeter, which is the width of a standard A5 notebook. And that was quite a success. I simply trimmed each signature by itself. So as you can see, this is the batch that hasn't been trimmed yet. I simply folded out my paper trimmer and then placed the stitched part on the 148 millimeter mark on the paper trimmer, and then simply ran the rotary trimmer over the foredge about 5 times. Not very, I didn't really have to use much strength because you only need light force for this paper trimmer, and that fixed the problem of uneven foredges. So now finally we have this entire block of signatures, and this is the part where we put all of the signatures together using the hanging parts of the thread. As you can see here, these are the threads that I left hanging deliberately in preparation for the next step. And this was also a difficult part because uh, of my right hand, and because apparently the threads that I left hanging were too short. What I had to do actually was I had to clamp the signatures together and make sure that everything was straight, and then I had to knot each hanging thread to the hanging thread beside it and do the same thing to all the other hanging threads side by side. I did okay with one end, but on the other hand some of the hanging threads were too short, so I just abandoned that step and thought of a way to compensate for it. Here is a close-up clip of what I was doing. I was simply taking one thread and then taking the thread beside it and then knotting them together twice, and then taking that second thread and the third thread and then knotting them together twice, and then taking the third thread and the fourth thread and then knotting them together twice, and so on and so forth. And like I said, I did okay with this end of the entire notebook, but on the other end, some of the hanging threads were too short, so I wasn't able to do this properly. And then I just cut off the excess thread, leaving about a 1 centimeter length of thread hanging behind. As you can see, the block is not even secure. You can see it flopping around. The next step is the stitching of the signatures together. The goal here is to stitch together all of the signatures using one thread on the needle, and then stitching them through all of the threads that are facing outwards, like so. It was another difficult task because the thread kept breaking when I pulled too hard on it, because it wasn't really made for bookbinding, and I even had to use my fine nose tweezers to help out in pulling the needle in between the signatures if it fell through. I knew then that this step alone would not do to build a strong spine. The spine has to be very strong because it is a thick notebook, and I will be flipping through it a lot for a longer time. But I will show you how I compensated for it. Enter good old Elmer's glue and a brush. This is actually a flat foundation brush that I bought from Watson's about a year ago when I tried using makeup, but that was short-lived. It didn't go well. Now I am using it for crafting things like these. And don't worry, if you wash the brush immediately after using it with water-based glue, you won't ruin the brush at all. And my plan is to glue the spine using the glue and the brush, and then I have chosen all of the heaviest books that I had on hand to place on top of the block of paper while the glue is drying overnight. Now I had to use some protective strips of paper because I knew for sure that the foundation brush was kind of too big and it might smear the glue beyond the block of paper. So I used these two strips of paper for the front and the back of the block, and they're really just there for protection. Just a little anecdote at this point. I learned how to do this in 8th grade. And when I shared some photos of the ongoing project on social media, one of my high school classmates, Maria Fe, commented, "Hey, we did that in one of our 8th grade classes. Our teacher was Miss Peñaredondo." I'm glad you remember because I remember too. But my project, I remember, was unfinished because I don't remember ever using the crocodile paper for the cover that my classmate Maria Fe mentioned. So, just a little anecdote about that. And now you can see me putting the protective strips on the block of paper and then putting the heavy books on top of everything. I left this on to dry overnight and then I continued the next morning. By the way, just in the off chance that you're interested, these are the heavy books that I used to weigh my project down. The book on the top is The Seven Basic Plots by Christopher Booker. It is now the next day, and here is our block of paper, all dried up with a spine enforced by glue. I was quite proud of how it looked because everything was straight, everything was aligned, the spine and the foredge was straight, and the top and the bottom were straight, and the solid block of paper simply felt substantial to me. It felt solid and strong. And then I opened the notebook to each page to check if each spread does lie flat, and at this point I considered the binding a success because there was no glue overruns in between each signature and everything was aligned and all pages lied flat when opened and the binding did not crack. And then I simply used a rusty old cutter, which was all I could find in the house, to cut off the excess of those protective strips of paper that I used during the gluing process. We are now at the last steps of the project, so please bear with me a little while longer. The next step is that we put in the end paper to both the front and the back of the notebook, and for this I simply created a single sheet signature using 2 pieces of A5 paper like so, and then one would go into the front and one would go into the back, and I simply used once more the Elmer's glue and the foundation brush. And I also made sure to lay down some paper towels in between the pages that won't be glued and the pages that will be glued so that the dampness will not penetrate into the pages that should not be glued. I hope it makes sense. But when you wet any paper with glue, it becomes damper than usual. So some of the dampness might seep through to the pages that are not supposed to wrinkle. So in order to prevent the wrinkles that will be caused by the damp pages because of the glue, I simply put in sheets of paper towel in between. I did that step both for the front and the back. And then we are ready for the covers and the spine, which is the last step of the notebook binding process. For the cover, I just cut up this rigid blue folder that I found lying around the house. It's not very pretty, I know, but the appearance of the actual cover and spine will not really matter, I promise. I cut 2 pieces into A5 size and then glued each piece onto the end paper that we just glued to the paper block. Remember that one? And then here is a clip of me doing the exact same thing on the other side of the paper block. I put some of the books over the project again while we work on the spine and then put it aside. For the spine, I cut a piece of old fabric. I think this is a polyester blend because it's a little bit stiff and dense, which I like, but it's also not very thick and it also still flexes like fabric, which is important, and I will show you why later. I used the foundation brush once more to lay down a rather thick layer of glue onto one side of the fabric spine and then place that over the spine, making sure that the entire fabric is flat and truly adhered to both the stitched spine of the paper block and the front and back covers. I even used the handle of the foundation brush to push the fabric more onto the surfaces of the covers and the spine. As you can see here, the finished spine is looking quite good. It shows the ridges that was created by the stitching, and it feels solid. It doesn't feel like it's going to come apart at any moment, and I really like it. And now finally, here comes the most fun part, choosing an external cover for my new A5 notebook. I unearthed my collection of Hobonichi cousin covers, which I placed in this orange box. And these collections are of cousin covers and cover on covers selected and purchased from 27 to 2018. That light blue one at the top is actually not mine, it's Chandler's, but he was not using it, so I took it back. I have a few unboxing videos of Hobonichi cousin covers, and I will link them down below. In those videos, I explained my criteria for choosing the covers, and I hope you enjoy watching them. I finally settled on this dark green one with the yellow and gray flowers because I think it's really very pretty and it has a matching handkerchief. Isn't that really so cute? But I don't plan to use the handkerchief. I plan to just store it in my collection. And then I put a cover on cover over the cover to protect it from wear and tear because it's so precious. I don't want it to be destroyed in any way. And then all we need to do is to slide in the notebook and we are done. And that is it. With limited resources under lockdown, I was able to make a blank, thick A5 notebook for my new anti-planner volume. And I was also finally able to use my Hobonichi cover collection. Now the only problem is that I would need lines because I write wonkier than usual with my broken right wrist, but I will cross the bridge when I get there because this is the unplanned life. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to leave a comment and a thumbs up. Thanks for watching. Bye.